What if I told you that Ferrari has found something in Fiorano that could suddenly erase Mercedes' biggest advantage, right after the FIA intervened? Because what seemed like a simple private test under artificial rain has uncovered something much bigger. Hidden data, key improvements to the SF26, and a decision by the FIA that forces Mercedes to change its engine, changing the balance of power in the middle of the 2026 season. Ferrari arrived at the Fiorano test at a time where, although the results showed a certain stability with constant podiums, the technical reality of the SF26 made it clear that they were still one step behind Mercedes, especially in classification and energy management, two areas that were making the real difference at the start of the 2026 season. It was not a problem of the general concept of the car, but of execution in the details that define the tenets. And it is precisely there where this test begins to take on a completely different value than the one it appeared from the outside. Because officially everything was framed within a Pirelli test in artificial wet conditions, something completely regulated and apparently limited in terms of the direct development of the car, but Ferrari saw an opportunity that others did not know or could not exploit. Use a perfectly controlled environment to understand how the car responds in extreme situations, eliminating variables such as real weather or unpredictable degradation, which allowed them to focus on correlating aerodynamic and energy data with a precision that cannot be achieved on a race weekend. This is where the figure of Lewis Hamilton comes in, because his role in this test goes far beyond simply riding and accumulating kilometers. The 142 laps completed in a single day not only reflect workload, but also an accelerated adaptation process to the SF26, a completely different car from what he had previously driven, and which in these conditions allowed him to explore limits that simply cannot be touched in the race. Each run, each lap, each adjustment was aimed at something very specific. Understanding how to extract maximum performance in scenarios where they were previously losing to Mercedes. And Ferrari's big problem up to this point was not the lack of pure pace in the race, but the inability to maintain a consistent energy delivery at key moments, something that was clearly evidenced by the phenomenon of super clipping, forcing the car to sacrifice acceleration to recover energy, a structural defect that conditioned both qualifying and defense on the straight. This not only affects the lap time, but also the driver's confidence, because it completely breaks the predictability of the car in extreme situations. Therefore, the Fiorano test cannot be understood as a simple test session, but as a real laboratory where Ferrari was directly attacking its most critical weaknesses. Cornering stability, aerodynamic efficiency, and energy management were not isolated objectives, but part of the same problem: how to make the car more consistent and exploitable in all types of conditions, especially those where Mercedes was making a difference. But the most important thing about this act is not only what Ferrari was doing, but the moment in which he was doing it. Because while they were accumulating data at Fiorano, they had already identified the root of one of their biggest disadvantages against Mercedes, and were preparing the ground for what would come next: a regulatory change that could completely alter the competitive balance. And that is where this test stops being technical and becomes strategic, and this is where everything changes. Because while Ferrari was executing that almost perfect test in Fiorano, in parallel a much more important battle was developing off the track. A battle that is not won with fast laps, but with regulations, technical pressure, and evidence. And that is where the FIA comes in as the absolute protagonist of this story. Ferrari was no longer simply trying to improve its car, it was directly attacking the basis of Mercedes' advantage, and it did so where it hurts most: on the legality of its performance. What they discovered by analyzing the telemetry was something that, although subtle, had a brutal impact on classification. The behavior of the Mercedes-AMG UK system did not follow the progressive logic established by the regulations, but rather maintained a constant maximum delivery until the last moment and then cut off abruptly, generating a power peak that in practical terms meant a direct advantage in the last meters of the lap. This is not a minor detail, because in Formula One, where differences are measured in thousands, this type of behavior can decide poles, starting positions, and consequently entire races. And Ferrari knew it. That's why they didn't just observe it. They took it directly to the FIA, forcing an investigation that completely changed the competitive context. The reaction was immediate. The FIA not only opened a formal analysis after the Chinese Grand Prix, but also reached a resolution that directly shakes Mercedes. They will have to modify their power unit before June 1st, eliminating that regulatory loophole that they had exploited until now. In other words, one of your biggest ranking weapons has an expiration date. And this is where everything connects with Fiorano in an almost perfect way. Because Ferrari wasn't testing blind. Every lap they took, every adjustment they made, was aligned with a very specific scenario. a championship where Mercedes will lose part of its structural advantage in a matter of weeks. This makes the test much more aggressive than it seems. It is no longer development, it is anticipation. Ferrari not only seeks to improve, it seeks to position itself exactly at the moment when its rival weakens. But there is another even more important detail, and it is the psychological and technical impact that this generates on Mercedes. Because suddenly, the team that clearly dominated the start of the season finds itself in a completely different situation. They know that their advantage is being questioned, they know that they will have to make changes, and they know that Ferrari is finding performance right now. That is why it is no coincidence that Mercedes has also reacted by organizing parallel tests in this same period. It's not a coincidence. It's a direct answer. It is confirmation that they perfectly understand what is happening. Ferrari has taken a step forward at just the most dangerous moment possible. And all of this leads us to a conclusion that completely changes the narrative of the season. Until now, Ferrari was the pursuer, the team trying to close the gap. But after Fiorano and the intervention of the FIA, the scenario begins to reverse. Because the real question is no longer whether Ferrari can catch up to Mercedes, but whether Mercedes will be able to maintain its advantage when it starts to lose its key weapons. And now, we reach the point where all this stops being theory and begins to become reality, because what Ferrari has built in silence between Fiorano and the FIA offices is about to face its first real test, and that test has its own name: Miami. Because the true impact of everything we have seen is not measured in test laps or in technical documents, it is measured on the track when the SF26 has to demonstrate whether all that work in aerodynamic efficiency, stability and energy management really translates into pure performance against a Mercedes that will no longer arrive with the same weapons. Ferrari has prepared this moment with almost surgical precision. Not only do they arrive with the data from the Fiorano test, they arrive with a package of updates described internally as a package and a half, an aggressive evolution that includes key changes to the rear wing, the bottom and the general behavior of the car, all focused on a very clear objective: closing the gap on the straight and eliminating the weaknesses that had conditioned them in qualifying. And this is where timing changes everything. Because while Ferrari introduces improvements to boost its performance, Mercedes is forced to modify its power unit due to the intervention of the FIA, which means that not only do they have to defend their position, they have to do so by adapting, recalibrating, and potentially losing part of that performance that gave them an advantage at key moments. These types of situations in Formula One are extremely delicate. It's not just about losing power or efficiency, it's about breaking a balance that was already optimized. Each change in the power unit affects energy delivery, thermal management, the way the driver uses the car in qualifying, and that is not corrected overnight. Meanwhile, Ferrari arrives in the opposite direction. More data, more understanding of the car, an increasingly adapted Hamilton and a consolidated Leclerc as a reference for the team. The difference is clear. One evolves from stability, the other has to react from pressure. But there is something even more important that defines this final act, and that is the change in narrative. Because if Miami confirms what Fiorano has hinted at, the season stops being a chase and becomes a real opportunity to attack. Ferrari doesn't need to dominate, it just needs to get close enough at the exact moment Mercedes loses its structural advantage. And that moment is about to arrive. Because in Formula One, seasons are not won just with the fastest car, they are won by understanding when to attack, when to press and when to take advantage of the rival's mistake. Ferrari has already made its move. Now the question is inevitable. Can Mercedes withstand the blow, or are we about to see the beginning of a power shift in 2026? What has happened between Fiorano and the FIA is not just another episode of development in Formula One. It is a turning point that can completely redefine the 2026 season. Because Ferrari has not only improved its car, it has understood the exact moment in which it had to do so, aligning technical evolution, driver adaptation, and regulatory pressure in the same direction. The test in Fiorano is no longer relevant because of the times or the laps, and becomes key because of what it reveals. An SF26 that is beginning to be more efficient, more stable, and, above all, more exploitable in conditions where it previously lost to Mercedes. But even more importantly, it shows that Ferrari is no longer reacting, it's anticipating. And that anticipation intersects directly with the FIA's decision, which forces Mercedes to modify one of the areas where it had built the most advantage. This breaks the balance, introduces uncertainty, and opens a window that in Formula One rarely appears twice. Now it all comes down to one thing: execution. Because Ferrari has done everything necessary to get into position, but history is not written in the tests or in the offices, it is written on the track. Miami will be the first scenario where we will know if all this was a threat or the real beginning of a change of power. And that's where this story gets even more interesting. Because if Ferrari confirms what it has already hinted at, we will not be talking about a simple improvement. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.